All right, we're talking about the midterms coming up. There is no better mind to talk about these things with than Henry Olsen. He's an elections analyst with a long record of excellent election predictions because he follows the numbers no matter what. He doesn't let his own opinions get in the way. And he writes a regular column from a conservative point of view for the Washington Post, which tells you that he is also a man of courage and endurance. Henry, it's great to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you, Drew?
I'm good. So let's start before we talk about what's going to happen or what you predict with the midterms. Polls have really taken it in the neck for the last many years. Basically, people at this point feel the polls are completely ridiculous, and yet you use the polls a lot to think your way through these things. Do you find them to be reliable, or are they reliable if you do a certain thing, or how do you work with the polls?
Yeah, well, I think they are reliable-ish, which is to say that you rely on averages rather than individual polls. You look at what's behind the polls, that if you're an unsophisticated consumer of the polls, which is, say, virtually everyone who comments on them on major television stations, you're going to give a misleading picture. But you have to understand a couple things. That first of all, people aren't responding to the polls in the same way. So you have to look at them and say, does this make sense in light of what I know about the demographics of the sector being sampled, whether it's a state or a district? And secondly, you have to look and say, how does this compare to what I see happening nationally? And if you do that, you use them not as a inerrant lodestar, but as some evidence that can help you form opinions. They're actually still quite useful, but they're not as accurate and as helpful as they were 12 years ago.
Interesting. All right, so let's talk about. I mean, I saw that 538 is giving is leaning toward the Democrats in the Senate, toward the Republicans in the House. Trafalgar today put out a poll saying the Democrats are stronger, but you just wrote a column saying you think that the Republicans are getting stronger. Let's start with the House. What are you seeing now?
Yeah, the biggest thing about the House to understand is where the parties are playing in the battlefield. Is that when you look at the polls, they say that it's roughly tied in the national generic ballot on average, that both RCP, Real Clear Politics, and 538 have it within a point. But that's not what the party's behavior is telling us. What the party's behavior is telling us is that they see a lot of vulnerability in seats that Joe Biden won by as many as 14 points. And they don't see a whole lot of vulnerability in seats that Trump won that are held by Republicans. That's not consistent with a national polling average of it's roughly tied. That's consistent with parties seeing vulnerability in a potential R+5 or R+6, to use the polling language, meaning that they see the possibility that Republicans would win the national ballot by 5 or 6, because you're not going to get seats that Biden won by 10, 11, 12 points to shift on average unless Republicans win the national ballot by that much. So what the parties are telling us in the House is that the situation is leaning away from the Democrats by a larger margin than what the national polls are telling us, and that the potential exposure over time, over the next 4 weeks, is sharply in the Republicans' favor rather than in the Democrats' favor.
And when you translate that, because you're talking about a national average, when you translate that to individual races, are you confirmed in that feeling?
Yeah, well, that's roughly what I'm doing. Is I'm imputing usually what you'll do is you'll translate a national average to individual races. So Biden won by 4.5 points. So if it's in 2020, and the Democrats won the national vote by a little, somewhere over 3 points in 2020. So if it's a national average of 0, that's a shift of 3-4 points away from the Democrats. So you'd expect the competition zone to be somewhere in that area where anything that Trump won by a point or so, the Democrats could win if they have a strong candidate. Anything that Biden won by a couple of points, the Republicans can win. You would not expect to see people think that seats that Biden won by 10 points would be competitive, because 10 minus 4, the point shift, is 6. You'd say, okay, well, maybe he'll win by 6 or 8 points. That's not where you throw $4 million of money, is to try and drive that. But in fact, what you're seeing now, particularly this week, is both sides putting $1 million plus investment in seats that Biden won by 10 to 14 points. That's consistent with the environment that we saw in Virginia in 2021, where there was a pretty uniform shift of 12 points away from Biden's 2020. And what that would do is suggest a national environment that is very strong for Republicans if that continues to happen. So what I'm doing is looking at where are they putting money, subtracting Biden's, and saying, okay, this implies a national margin of this, and what it implies that the median seat that they're contesting is one that Biden won by 7 points. So that suggests Republicans are actually leading the national ballot by 2.5 points, because otherwise the party's investments make no sense.
I get it. Even an English major could understand that. I appreciate it. Now, how does that translate?
Well, I'm not sure I spoke English, but maybe you'd have to put it through Google Translate.
I got it, actually. Now, what about when you turn this over to the Senate races? I know the Democrats are less exposed in the Senate, and that's always been a harder hill to climb. What is it looking like now?
Yeah, fundamentally, the question is, do you think that Senate races are going to turn more on national trends or more on individual characteristics? Democrats made the argument in 2014 that they were going to do very well in Senate races because they had all these strong incumbents, and that Senate races turn on individual characteristics. Hello, they lost big. They lost 9 Senate seats or something. And the reason why is that wasn't true, or at least it wasn't true enough. And it's even gotten worse in the last few years, is that I took a look in every Senate race from 2014 to date and saw how many points ahead of the president's job approval rating the candidate of that party ran. Democrats tend to do a little bit better than you would expect from the job approval rating. But there's only 2 candidates of either party that ran 10 points or more ahead of their expected share of the vote based on presidential job approval. Joe Manchin and Susan Collins, who happen to be 2 of the longest serving senators in small states with consistent, moderate, bipartisan records. Mark Kelly, who's been in the Senate less than 2 years, doesn't qualify. Catherine Cortez Masto, who's been in the Senate less than 6 years and been a loyal Democratic vote, doesn't qualify. So what that means is history tells us they won't run more than 4 points ahead of Joe Biden's job approval. And what that suggests, again, is that these Senate races are going to turn more on national figures and less on individual situations than the Democrats are telling us. Take a look at the Senate polls. Democrats tend to be leading, but they're all stuck in the 44 to 47% range. What that means is that pretty much, and that's, again, consistent with what you see in the job approval ratings, that they're running a few points ahead of Biden, but they can't run the 10 points ahead of Biden they need to win outright. So that means there's a lot of voters undecided who are leaning against the Democrats this time. And what do you think they're going to do in the last month? History tells us that they'll break late to the anti-party that's not in power. And last time I checked, despite what the January 6th committee is trying to tell us, the actual president of the United States is named Joe Biden, not Donald Trump.
So you think there's still a possibility the Republicans could take the Senate? I think
it's a probability.
You think it's a probability? Wow. Okay.
We're 4 weeks out. My final prediction will be made in the pages of the Washington Post right before election, and I reserve the right to change my opinion based as numbers and data change.
Yeah.
But right now, I'd say that there is a probability that the Republicans will control the Senate, and not a big control, 1 or 2 seats, but that if you forced me to bet right now, I would say the Republicans will gain 1 or 2. And if you take a look at the website predictit.com, which is where people put their money where their mouth is, they actually have the Senate as a 50-50 toss-up, as opposed to what you're seeing on the poll aggregating sites, which suggest the Democrats have it. So again, where political pros go to make money from other political pros, suggest a 50-50 race for the Senate. And I think that in 3 weeks' time, they'll be where I am right now.
Wow. One of the big narratives that went around this season was the candidates that Trump had picked were so offbeat and so wild and so Trumpian and extreme that Trump had just ruined everything. He just completely destroyed the Republicans' chances. And then, some of these debates that went on, J.D. Vance against Tim Ryan in Ohio and Oz against Fetterman, I thought Trump's candidates actually did great. I thought they just ripped the other guy to shreds, actually. Was that whole narrative just nonsense? I mean, do you think that there's any truth to that?
Yeah, I would say it's neither nonsense nor gospel truth.
Okay.
I've been a fan of J.D. Vance for years. I've known him for years. Wrote columns supporting his candidacy before he was an apple in Donald Trump's eye. But so it doesn't surprise me that J.D. would run rings around Tim Ryan in a debate. But the fact is, they did take extreme positions, and they did associate themselves with somebody who remains very unpopular with the median voter in this country is an independent who is roughly moderate on issues who dislikes both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So what that did is give them room for pause, which is what do I care more about, as opposed to a generic R candidate who wouldn't trigger those things. Doesn't mean it's going to be dispositive. It's quite clear that all of these candidates that are being touted as weak are running behind where they should be running behind as a generic Republican. It's clear that the Democrats are gaining something from it. Most Senate candidates only run in the recent era about 2 points ahead of where their presidential job approvals would predict. Candidates running against Trump's people are running 4, 5, or 6 points ahead. But Biden is so unpopular, that's probably still not enough. So that's what I'm saying. There's truth to it, and it's not gospel truth.
Got it. That's really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the issues. The New York Times wrote a hilarious piece in which they said, the GOP keeps trying to change the subject from abortion, to things like crime that people really. What are the things that people care about right now?
Yeah, I mean, you could have just stopped. The New York Times writes a hilarious piece. Period.
Yeah, that is it. But still,
look, let's as Paul Harvey used to say in our youth, let's talk about the rest of the story. The rest of the story is the Democrats, led by the New York Times, have tried to make the story all about abortion for 4 months. The polls have consistently shown, and I'm not talking about Republican polls, I'm talking about polls, even polls that show the Democrats ahead in the generic ballot, show that independents do not rank abortion highly when they're asked what is the issue that they care most about. They care about, wait for it, inflation in the economy. So this is not Republicans trying to shift the narrative away from something that the people are already thinking about. This is a failed effort by the New York Times and its media mini-me's to shift the narrative to something they cared about. They did not succeed.
So we only got about 2 minutes left. The thing that really strikes me is the some of the stuff that's happening with the transgender issue, with the issue of putting pornographic picture books in schools, these moms showing up at these meetings clearly with their hair on fire. Is that having an effect, do you think? To me, I look at that and I can't believe it's actually happening. I can't believe that people are not, storming the schools at a much higher rate, storming some of these hospitals that are butchering children. Do you think that's having an effect on the polls, or is it just outside of most people's?
I think I think this is one of those issues that, like a tsunami, is building power under the water. As opposed to one that's going to crash ashore in 3.5 weeks' time, that people are seeing this more and more. This attracts revulsion across the vast majority of people in this country, but it is not yet at a level where somebody has nationalized it. Republicans are not nationalizing this in their advertising. They are not emphasizing this as an element of partisan difference. And because it's local, it's hard to say, well, this is the fault of Congressman or Congresswoman X. But I don't think you can find any of these places that are putting these things in schools where the elements in charge are Republicans. I think it could very easily become a defining issue over time as the abuses and excesses are uncovered more. And then you have a question of, will Democrats cut that element of their party loose? Well, we've seen over the last 2 years, Democrats will cut no element of their party loose. They will position themselves so that they look to be look down on an element of their party, but they will never just say, You do not speak for the Democratic Party. You want to say defund the police, you do not speak for the Democratic Party. You want to abolish ICE, you do not speak for the Democratic Party, because there's a minority but significant element within the Democratic Party that does want those things. It's like when George McGovern was attacked in 1972 as the candidate of acid amnesty abortion, and the Rolling Stone columnist Hunter S. Thompson saw this ad and was asked what he thought, and he said, "It's great, except I'm for acid amnesty." Yeah. When a third of your party is for these things, it's hard to move against them. And so this gives the Republicans the opening, if they're wise enough to figure out how to exploit it, but not this year.
Got it. Okay. Well, Henry Olsen, always incredible clarity. He writes for the Washington Post. If you can stand the rest of the Washington Post, his columns are always informative and incisive. It's great talking to you, Henry. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
For more terrific content like that, like and subscribe. And don't forget to subscribe to the Andrew Klavan Podcast.